Hello everybody, Mr. Tiller here. Today I'm going to be going over a tutorial on the SER primer on ecological restoration, the reading guide. If you have questions after this tutorial, please feel free to bring those to class. Let's start right away with section number 1. What is ecological restoration? When we talk about ecological restoration, we're talking about any activity that is designed to bring an ecosystem back to some state that it existed in the past. And one of the things that I want to stress about this is you have to pick a time frame. So for example, in Wisconsin, it's important to pick a frame of reference. Are you talking about what the ecosystem looked like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago? And then the goal is to bring that ecosystem back to what it looked like to whatever time frame you chose. The author states, number 2, restoration attempts to return an ecosystem to its historical trajectory. What is meant by the historical trajectory? The historical trajectory is the direction the ecosystem was evolving before the degradation, the disturbance, the human involvement. So what was the path that that ecosystem was on before it was interfered with, basically. Section number 3. When is an ecosystem considered to be recovered? For our purposes, we consider an ecosystem to be recovered when it can function without any further assistance. So we're going to go through some exercises in our prairie where we try to eradicate some unwanted species. We start to add new species through seeding and putting in various plants. At some point, it's assumed that we can stop all those things and that ecosystem can function without our assistance. Now, in reality, that's going to be very difficult, especially on an ecosystem the size of the school forest that we deal with and its location within a city. But that's the overall goal. The reference ecosystem is going to be very important, number 6 in section 4. The reference ecosystem is essentially the model that we're going to use for the various projects that we do. So when we look at our prairie, we will use a model which guides our restoration efforts. So what do we do in our prairie? What plants belong in our prairie? What should the community that we're trying to restore look like? For reference, we'll use various ecosystems that are found around Verona, and that will help guide our restoration project. I think most of these other questions are pretty self-explanatory. Species redundancy, that's a concept where you have multiple species that play similar roles within the dynamics of the ecosystem. So if you remember back to your biology class, we have producers, we have consumers. Within any given ecosystem, there are many species that are producers. There are many species that are decomposers. So the redundancy is the presence of multiple species that kind of do the same thing. One of the ways to measure, number 10, genetic fitness is to think about the resilience of an ecosystem to stresses or changes in the environment. Do those stresses or changes in the environment, like a drought, for example, do they really knock that ecosystem back, or is that ecosystem able to withstand a certain amount of stress? Whenever we talk about ecology, this is number 11, really we're talking about the interactions of the community. And for our purposes, we're going to think of everything in terms of what role it plays within that community. So we're currently in the process of learning a whole bunch of different species that exist within the prairie. Those species by themselves are not unimportant, but really what we're interested in is how all those species interact within a particular ecosystem to create a community. Number 12 is an interesting one. For restoration ecologists, this idea of autogenic processes that just take place naturally, when do those natural processes of the ecosystem really get going? Number 12. And the idea is once you return the native species, then it's assumed that all those ecological processes will also start up again. In the case of like our prairie restoration, we focus mostly on restoring the vegetation. And then the assumption is once the vegetation is back, for example, then the various insects that are native to our prairie will also return, and all those ecological processes that involve the community as a whole will start to commence. But it starts with returning the species that would have been found in that ecosystem before some major interruption occurred or disturbance. What are those examples of disturbances or stressors? Number 13, fires, floods, drought can be a disturbance. Human involvement can be a disturbance. In the case of Wisconsin, the major disturbance in our location was agriculture in the 1800s. So lots of examples of that. Let's move on to section 5. Number 16 is an interesting one, and I do want you to pay attention to that. When we talk about reference ecosystems, in our case, given the current time, many of the reference ecosystems are gone. So it's difficult to go back and to find a prairie that we can use as a reference ecosystem. Where do those exist? Most of the prairies in southern Wisconsin are gone. So instead, we have to rely on sources of information from the past. And so that can be kind of a tricky thing. How do you know whether those sources are reliable? How do you know whether those sources are complete? But as the surveyors came across from the east, they did describe the vegetation in detail all across the Midwest, and including Wisconsin. And so those original survey records are available to us, and they provide us with a pretty good picture of what the landscape looked like. But keeping in mind that when we talk about a reference ecosystem, really what we're talking about is something that existed in the past and was described in the past. Okay, moving on here. Exotic species number 18. When we talk about our native ecosystems, we're assuming that there's a collection of plants that were here for some time and evolved together. An exotic species is a species that was introduced into the ecosystem that wasn't previously there. Now, in the case of southern Wisconsin, that occurred in a large scale with the arrival of the European settlers. So those European settlers brought all kinds of plants over, and since that time, as more and more people have entered our state, with those immigrations come lots of other exotic species, plants, insects, etc. Number 19, what are 3 methods for conducting an evaluation of restoration project? How do you know whether or not your project is progressing the way that you want it to? Well, the first thing you can do, of course, is compare that to your reference ecosystem. You can also go out and collect quantitative data, and then you can look at a trajectory analysis. Do you feel like your project is on the right trajectory? Is it on the right path toward whatever it is that you want it to be? Your ecosystem. And then the last thing I'll cover here just quickly, the difference between ecological restoration and restoration ecology. Ecological restoration is just the practice of restoring the ecosystem, where restoration ecology is actually based on a scientific approach, and it describes the scientific approach that you take to go through your various projects. This is going to be fairly important as we conduct our own ecological restoration projects. We always want to keep in mind that we apply science to those, and the science is no different whether it happens outside, in our prairie, up in a chemistry lab, in a genetics lab, wherever. All science follows the same basic rules and conventions. Okay, I think that's enough for now. If you have any additional questions, please bring those to class. Signing off.